Okay. Good evening, everybody. Tonight's class is sponsored by Jerry and Sheila Hermel in memory of Jerry's mother, Shandel Bas David, whose yahrzeit it is, and they are learning being Aliyah for the Neshama. I want to begin with a brief introduction to the importance of this topic. And this topic we're going to discuss tonight is the mitzvah to live in the land of Israel, which, I'll spoiler alert, it is definitely a mitzvah and a good thing to live in the land of Israel. But the inspiration behind studying something like this and the great debates, as we're going to see, the great decisions that those have had to live in the land of Israel and the like, really stems from a pasuk in Sefer Yirmiyahu, where Yirmiyahu, a Navi, is lamenting over the destruction of the temple. He says, Karolach Tzion, that they call you Tzion, he dorish ein la, but there's no one to inquire of you, meaning that you're empty, you're gone, it's empty, there's nothing there, there's nothing in the land of Israel. The destruction of the land is everywhere, and it's a shame. There's no one there to be dorish you, to be with you. The Gemara in Rosh Hashanah on Daf Lamed, however, says that while, of course, there is a destruction in the land of Israel, and unfortunately, even to this day, we are experiencing, although we are, as my Rabbi Rav Hershel Schefter says, we're in the Haskalta de Geula, we're in the beginning of the redemption. In fact, the Chazon Ish, Rav Avram Yishai Karelitz, in 1948, just to give you some context, Rav Avram Yishai Karelitz, the Chazon Ish, as he was referred to by his world-renowned book titled The Chazon Ish, The Vision of Man. He was one of the leaders of the Haredi community. He was the one that founded the Haredi community in the land of Israel. It did not really exist, at least it was not very active before he got there. And he himself said in 1948 that while the Geula is not yet complete, at least in his mind, he views as though Galus is over. Now that we have the state of Israel, that Artzenu biyadenu, that our land is under our control, but nevertheless, we'd be kidding ourselves to and pulling the wool over our own eyes if we thought that everything was just perfect, and it was as if there's nothing that's going on, and as if there's no gullus and in the land of Israel itself. There's no exile in the land of Israel. What do you mean? There's still rockets flying into Israel. There's still terrorists that want to kill every single Jew that lives in the land of Israel. It's not such a simple thing. So even today, even while we have Jews living in the land of Israel, still it's ein dorish love. It's still empty in the sense that the Geula is not complete yet. So the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah says, that what the Gemara means by it, that ein dorish love, that there's no one to interact with the land, it was not only referring to a physical interaction, but even an intellectual pursuit, even an intellectual interaction with the land of Israel. And the Gemara says from this pasuk in Yirmiyahu, how important it is, the Navi is telling us, that although we don't have completely yet, and hopefully soon, the land of Israel completely in our hands, and complete control in order so that we can be free Jews to do the mitzvot Hashem in order to connect with Him on the most pure level. In the meantime, though, it's incumbent upon us to learn the laws of the land of Israel, to learn the laws of mitzvos Eretz Yisrael. And therefore, before we can even get to the mitzvos of the details of how one should live in the land of Israel, of the different halachos that would apply specifically to the land, we have to take an even further step back and talk about the importance of actually living there, the mitzvah to actually live in the land of Israel, and how central it is to our lives. The mitzvah to live in the land of Israel, at least according to most Rishonim, is not explicit as a commandment. Whereas we have other commandments Ba'erev tochlu matzos, that we have an obligation the night of Pesach to eat matzah. Zachar es yom HaShabbos lekatsha. We have an obligation to make kiddush, to sanctify the holy Shabbos. There are mitzvos that are very direct. In fact, we have 613 mitzvos that are very direct in terms of giving us a directive of what to do. However, when we look through the Torah, the mitzvah to live in the land of Israel is not very direct. We know that it's a central theme throughout the Torah, beginning all the way with Avram Avinu. Avram Avinu, it's part of his covenant, is the fact that his children and his offspring will live in the land of Israel, and the land of Israel was promised to us. In fact, the very first Rashi on the Torah, the very first comment that Rashi makes on the Torah already starts talking about the land of Israel. Where the very first Rashi asks, why is it that the Torah begins with Bereshis bara Elokim es hashamayim v'saaretz? Why is it that the Torah begins with creation? The Torah, being that it's a rule book for our lives, the Torah should begin with the very first mitzvah. The mitzvah being HaChodesh Hazeh Lachem, Rosh Chadashim, the mitzvah of sanctifying the new month, which is the first mitzvah we were given as a people. That's where the Torah should begin. If the Torah is a rule book, therefore, it should begin with the first rule. Why does it begin with creation? So Rashi, and the Rishonim give different answers to this, our commentators give different answers, but Rashi, the very first Rashi on the Torah says, you know why? Why is it that the Torah begins with Bereshis? Because God is trying to show us that he controls the entire world. He controls all the lands. So if he controls all the lands, what does that mean? He's the landlord. And if he's the landlord, he decides who gets to be a tenant in which land and who gets to be a tenant in other lands. And it was his decision that the Jewish people are the tenants to his land of Israel. The very first Rashi in the Torah already starts talking about the importance of the Jewish people living in the land of Israel and how it is our birthright. However, the obligation to live there is not explicit in the Torah. And even when you look through the Gemara, you look through the Mishnayos, and you look through Shulchan Aruch, you don't find that the mitzvah to live in the land of Israel is explicit. It's not explicit anywhere in Shulchan Aruch. It's not explicit anywhere in the Mishnah. There's no Mishnah that says one must pick up and move to the land of Israel. There's no halacha in Shulchan Aruch, even though the Shulchan Aruch, written by Rav Yosef Karo, Zatzal, 1488 to 1575. He was born in Toledo in Spain in 1488 and moved to the land of Israel and died in Tzfat. After spending time in Turkey, where he began writing his magnum opus, the Beis Yosef, where he has an encyclopedia of every single practical halacha that applies today, and then wrote an index to that work called the Shulchan Aruch. In that index in the Shulchan Aruch and in the Beis Yosef, never does he say one has an obligation to pick up and move to the land of Israel. So then, therefore, where does this obligation come from? He does hint to it. I should point out, he does hint to it. He hints to it, and the Mishnah hints to it as well with regards to a different halacha. It's actually, of all places, it's in his section of marital law, in the section, the third section of the Shulchan Aruch, called section Even HaEzer, where he discusses marital law, and in Siman Ayin Hey, in chapter 75, notes 3, 4, and 5 over there, the Shulchan Aruch does note a halacha brought down in the Mishnah that, let's say that there's a couple. One couple has a burning desire to move to the land of Israel, or Shlomo Kluger, Zatzal. The Chachma Shlomo explains not just a desire to move to the land of Israel for financial reasons or whatever reason it may be. You've always wanted to learn from, the IDF's style of fighting, and therefore you're not going to be able to be enlisted there unless you move to the land of Israel. No, we're talking about that one moves to the land of Israel because they desire to fulfill the mitzvah to become closer to God through moving to the land of Israel. So there's one spouse that wants to move to the land of Israel, and another spouse that does not want to move to the land of Israel. It doesn't matter which one it is. So says the Mishnah, that's grounds for divorce. Not only is it grounds for divorce, but it would be a divorce against the other's will. For example, let's say it is the husband who does not want to move to the land of Israel, while the wife has a burning desire to fulfill the mitzvah of living in the land of Israel. Therefore, there is we would force the husband to divorce his wife in order so that she can go live in the land of Israel. And if, let's say, it is the wife that's being recalcitrant and the husband wants to move to the land of Israel, so he can move to the land of Israel, divorce her, and he would not be obligated to pay her the prenuptial agreement, the ksuba. She would absolve herself of getting the ksuba. So we see hinted in the Mishnah, it's recorded in Shulchan Aruch, that there is definitely something about living in the land of Israel to the point that it would be grounds for divorce, but never once does it have this obligation that's codified anywhere. One must live in the land of Israel. The Ramban, Rabbeinu Moshe ben Nachman, who we spoke about last time we were together on a Wednesday night like this, the Ramban lived from 1194 to 1270. The Ramban first lived in Spain, and then he later in his life actually risked his life in order to move to the land of Israel. And throughout his work, throughout the Ramban's work on the Torah, he speaks about the importance of living in the land of Israel. I should point out, by the way, why is it that it's so important to live in the land of Israel? Granted, okay, fine, let's assume for now it's a mitzvah. But there are lots of important, there's lots of mitzvahs. There's 613 mitzvahs. We don't speak about shaking a lulav the same way we talk about moving to the land of Israel. There are not multiple organizations that have been set up in different denominations of Judaism to get Jews to live in the land of Israel, because it's just like any other mitzvah. It's obviously a very central and important mitzvah. There aren't those same organizations in order to get Jews to eat matzah on Pesach. Obviously, living in the land of Israel is a very significant thing. So why is it so significant? So the Ramban actually, in his commentary on the Torah, writes something amazing. I think I pointed out in the past when we were speaking about the Ramban, that the Chassam Sofer, Rabbeinu Moshe HaSofer, Rabbeinu Moshe Sofer was first a Rav in Frankfurt, and then moved to Petersburg in Hungary, and really became a famous Gaon, a famous genius Talmudic scholar there, and halakhic decider. Even though he always referenced his German roots, his Frankfurt roots, whenever he would sign his response, he would sign them, Hineni Moshe Hakatan, I am the small Moshe Frankfurt, from Frankfurt. Anyway, so the Chassam Sofer told his family the importance of learning the Ramban's commentary on the Torah. And he wrote in his ethical will, he commanded his family, he said, you have to make sure you always learn the Ramban al Torah, the Ramban's Nachmanides commentary to the written Torah, because found within the Ramban's commentary to the Torah are all ethical principles that one needs to know. You want to know what the Torah has to say about X, Y, and Z? You look in the Ramban al Torah. And the Ramban, on his commentary to the Torah, has throughout his commentary the importance of living in the land of Israel, and he explains the following. He says, because living in the land of Israel is more than just a mitzvah, he says. But why is it that we as Jews need the land of Israel? Is it for nationalistic purposes? Is it in order for us to identify with a certain culture? Is it because we as Jews just can't go without good falafel? Like, why do we need a land that's specifically ours? Like, we're hungry for land. But Eretz Yisrael is this tiny little sliver of a land. It's such. Why do we need the land of Israel? So the Ramban says very simply. He says that when you look in the Torah, you find that when Moshe Rabbeinu starts telling the Jews the laws of Dayanim, the laws of setting up proper judges, smack in the middle of that discussion, he discusses the importance of readying yourself in order to live in the land of Israel. And part of his discussion of readying yourself to live in the land of Israel is intertwined with this discussion of setting up proper court systems. The Ramban explains because that is the whole purpose of living in the land of Israel. The land of Israel is supposed to be the central location for service of God, in order so that there could be one place in the world, doesn't need to be a big place, a small place, one place that's supposed to be the epicenter for spirituality, and proper connection to God. Now, how do we know that the world is going to function through proper ethical principles? Well, unless there's a society set up on a specific land that's going to dictate those proper ethical principles, it's not going to happen. That's the whole purpose of the land of Israel. And the Ramban throughout his commentary discusses this. And he points out that we do find in the Torah an obligation to live in the land of Israel. When was that given? That was given by God to Moshe after the Jews left Egypt and they approached the border of Israel. Right before Moshe Rabbeinu dies, right? They left Egypt, and after they leave Egypt, they cross the sea, and then they send in the Meraglim, they send in the spies to scout out the land. They shouldn't have done that, but they did it anyway, and it just extended their period before they moved into the land of Israel. But there was a commandment from God for the Jewish people at that time to move into the land of Israel. Therefore, says the Ramban, that we don't just see from their one obligation to live in the land of Israel, we even see an obligation to conquer the land of Israel. That applies then the same way it applies today, the same way it applied then. That there's an obligation to go conquer the land of Israel and then to live in the land of Israel, says the Ramban. He writes this in a number of places. The main issue, though, and this is where everybody, when discussing the mitzvah to live in the land of Israel, without a doubt, you spend most of your time discussing the Rambam, as we always do, where the Rambam, Maimonides, 1138 to 1204, was born in Spain, ended his life in Egypt. I think it's just interesting to point out, we're going to get to the ambiguity in the Rambam in terms of the obligation to live in the land of Israel and the mitzvah to live in the land of Israel. I think that it's just interesting to point out, noteworthy, that the Ramban, who speaks about the importance of living in the land of Israel, basically every opportunity he gets, actually had the schus to end his life in the land of Israel, whereas the Rambam, who it's a little bit, not clear whether or not the Rambam assumes there's a mitzvah to live in the land of Israel. Unfortunately, did not die in the land of Israel. Later, his body was moved to the land of Israel. But that's just something to point out. But I'm not a Navi. I have no clue what that represents. I just thought I'd point it out. The Ramban, though, there's ambiguity as to whether or not there's a mitzvah. Why is there such ambiguity? Because I think we've pointed out in the past, I even mentioned it this afternoon in the Working Man's Kollel, that the Rambam wrote a number of books. The Rambam wrote his commentary to the Mishnah when he was 31 years old. It was like the first art scroll where he summarized all of the Mishnayos in Arabic, giving you the insights found in the Talmud to explain the Mishnah and the halachic conclusion that comes out from each Mishnah. That he wrote when he was 31 years old. Later in life, he wrote a philosophic work called the Mor Nevuchim, where he was writing to people who were struggling in their faith to understand mitzvos and understand God, and he gives different explanations to the mitzvos that are easy to understand. But however, the Rambam's, Maimonides' main contribution to the Torah world was his Mishnah Torah, where the Mishnah Torah, as the name suggests, is a review and an explanation of the entire oral Torah, the entire oral tradition. And over there, what he writes in the introduction, he says, listen, there's a lot of Torah out there. There's a lot of commentary to understand the written Torah. There is the entire oral Torah, which is comprised of the Mishnah and the Sifra and the Sifrei and the Tosefta and the Mechilta and the Midrash Halacha and the Midrash Haggadah and all these different sources, primary sources that are found. And then you have all the Gemaras, you have the Yerushalmi, you have all of these original sources to bring down our oral tradition. It is so scattered and so inaccessible to the layperson. So therefore, I'm going to write a book. My book is going to codify every single law that is found in our oral tradition and in our written tradition. And I'm going to codify that. That's called the Mishnah Torah. He wrote it in 14 books. It's also referred to as the Yad Chazakah, the strong hand. Yud Dalet equals 14, the 14 books. And as an introduction to this work, he writes the 613 mitzvos. What are the 613 mitzvos? And he gives you, his methodology to figuring out what are the 613 mitzvos. Because the Gemara in Makos tells us that the pasuk says, Torah tziva lanu Moshe, that Torah was commanded to us through Moshe. Torah equals, in its numerical value, Taf plus Vav plus Resh plus Hey equals 611. God told us the first two of the 10 commandments, that I am your God and you cannot have any other gods. 611 plus 2 equals 613, says the Gemara Makos on Daf Chaf Daled Amud Beis. Therefore, there are 613 mitzvahs. Says the Rambam, well, what are those 613 mitzvahs? And many Rishonim deal with this, the Sefer HaChinuch and the Yereim and the Smag and many different, the Ramban himself as well, deal with what are the 613 mitzvahs. Because when you look through the Torah, there's not just 613 things I have to do, but seems like there are thousands of things I have to do. So what are the 613 mitzvahs? So the Rambam has his list. The Ramban, Nachmanides, who's always there to show us where the Rambam missed something, at the end of, as an appendix to the Rambam's list of the 613 mitzvos, he tells us, and here are the ones that the Rambam missed. And he points out that one of the ones the Rambam missed is that on his list of the 613, he never tells us that there's a mitzvah to live in the land of Israel. How could that be? There's no mitzvah to live in the land of Israel. The Ramban showed us in the Torah that there is an obligation to go conquer the land of Israel and to live there. So why didn't the Rambam include it in his list of the 613 mitzvahs? This is the major question that everyone deals with when trying to understand the Rambam and whether or not the Rambam includes the mitzvah to live in the land of Israel or not. So right off the bat, we'll say that the Stei Chemed, Chacham Medeni was a tremendous, is encyclopedist the word? Someone who creates encyclopedias. He created an encyclopedia called the Stei Chemed, which is unbelievable, where he goes through in alphabetical fashion every single concept found in the Talmud, not necessarily every single law that's found in the Talmud, but every single principle or every single discussion found in the Talmud. He then puts it into an alphabetical order and gives us in encyclopedic fashion everything that the Beis Yosef told us about it and all of the unique discussions on those particular halachos. He lived in the 19th century, lived from 1832. He died in 1904. He was born in Yerushalayim. He ended his life in Hebron. He was an unbelievable chacham, an unbelievable Torah scholar. Anyway, so the Stei Chemed quotes from the Knesset Agdola that the obligation to live in the land of Israel, at least according to the Rambam, is probably a rabbinic obligation, where if the Rambam didn't include it in his list of the 613, that means that it's not one of the 613 mitzvahs. Oh, so we have these obligations. We saw, remember, that Mishnah in Ksubos that told us about how not moving, if one spouse wants to move to the land of Israel and the other one doesn't, it would be grounds for divorce. Yeah, because it's still an obligation, and as religious Jews, we follow the rabbinic commandments the same way we follow the Torah commandments. So the Rambam probably assumes that it's a rabbinic obligation, but it's not a biblical obligation. Now, what happened to that comment of the Ramban, Nachmanides? Remember, he pointed out that the Torah explicitly says that there's an obligation to move to the land of Israel, to conquer the land of Israel. So says the Stei Chemed, that was referring to at that point in history. At that point in history, God told Moshe to then tell over to Yehoshua, who then was the one to lead the Jews into the land of Israel for its first conquest. That was what's called a hora'as shah, a one-time in history obligation to go, commandment to go and conquer the land of Israel. But after that moment, who says that there is that commandment continues? Once that command was completed as a nation, so then that's when it ended. Okay, granted, maybe there's still a rabbinic obligation to go live in the land of Israel. It's still a rabbinic mitzvah to go live in the land of Israel. But as a biblical commandment, at least according to the Sdei Chemed, in his understanding of the Rambam, there would be no biblical obligation. The Avnei Nezer, though, the Avnei Nezer, who we quote very, very often, Rav Avram Bornstein, who lived from 1838 to 1910, was the Sakachover Rebbe. Rav Avram from Sakachev was, as Rav Shechter puts it, my Rebbe Rav Hershel Shechter likes to say that the Avnei Nezer, the Sakachever Rebbe, was a super genius. The way he writes is just unbelievable. No one was as sharp as the Avnei Nezer. No one was as deep as the Avnei Nezer. No one had a breadth of knowledge like the Avnei Nezer. The Avnei Nezer, the Sakachev Rebbe, was unbelievable. He was literally a super genius. His creativity and his Piskei Halacha are unbelievable. The Avnei Nezer, in a very long responsa, in the second volume of his responsa, in the Yoredeya section, in chapter 454, I believe, Taf Nun Daled, 454. So the Avnei Nezer, he discusses this Rambam and how the Rambam leaves it out, and he says that who in their right mind would think that the Rambam would not include the mitzvah to live in the land of Israel? Of course the Rambam says it's a mitzvah to live in the land of Israel. Of course it's a biblical obligation to live in Israel. The Ramban, Nachmanides, was 100% right in pointing out those psukim to tell us that we have to conquer the land of Israel and we have to live in the land of Israel. So if that's the case, why did the Rambam leave it out of his list of the 613? Says the Avnei Nezer, he didn't need to list it. Why? Because he had already listed the obligation of destroying the other nations that are in the land. Hachareim taharimim, that we have an obligation to destroy the 7 nations that are conquering the land of Israel. We discussed that. Remember, before Purim, we discussed the obligation to destroy Amalek. So the Rambam already told us that there's an obligation to destroy the inhabitants of the land of Israel if they're not going to give it to the Jews. So if that's the case, so then he doesn't need to also tell us that, there's also an obligation to conquer the land and to live in the land. That's obvious. He already included it in other mitzvahs. I'll give you another example. He includes in there the mitzvah of trumos and maasros, separating the tithes that can only exist if we're living in the land of Israel. There are a number of mitzvahs. Shemitah can only exist if we're living in the land of Israel. Yovel can only exist if we're living in the land of Israel. There are many mitzvahs that can only exist if we're living in the land of Israel. Chadash. There's so many mitzvahs that only exist if we're living in the land of Israel. All the mitzvahs with regard to Beis Din can only exist if we're living in the land of Israel. Kiddush HaChodesh. All of these things can only, Sanhedrin, all of these things can only exist if we're living in the land of Israel. He includes appointing a melech, appointing a king can only exist if we're living in the land of Israel. Right? All of this can only exist if we're living in the land of Israel. He didn't need to, on top of that, tell us, by the way, there's a mitzvah to live in the land of Israel. It's obvious. And the Rambam himself, when he tells us his methodology, they're called the Shorashim, the roots of the 613 mitzvahs, where he explains his methodology to choosing the 613 out of all of the commandments found in the Torah. He tells us, I'm not going to list a mitzvah if it can be included in another mitzvah. It's as simple as that. So therefore, I'm not going to list the mitzvah to live in the land of Israel. That's what the Avnei Nezer explains. The Avnei Nezer gives another example of this, by the way. Or I think the Rambam already gives an example of this, where if he already lists one mitzvah that includes another mitzvah, he's not going to list that second mitzvah. So an example of that would be the building of the Beis HaMikdash. The Rambam includes in his list of the 613 mitzvahs the mitzvah to build the Beis HaMikdash. You know what is not included? Building the Aron Kodesh. Why? Because there's no Beis HaMikdash without an Aron Kodesh. As simple as that, right? So that's the concept the Avnei Nezer builds off of, and therefore the Avnei Nezer says, of course it's a mitzvah to live in the land of Israel. Of course we have to go live in the land of Israel. Of course the Ramban was correct. There is no disagreement here between the Ramban and the Rambam. Of course there's a mitzvah to live in the land of Israel. And it's a biblical mitzvah, a biblical obligation. However, the most radical view based on this Rambam is that of the view of the Megillas Esther. Rabbi Isaac de Leon was a 16th century posek living in Sfat. He was a contemporary of the Beis Yosef. He was younger than the Beis Yosef. His father was a I'm sorry, he was a little bit older than the Beis Yosef. I'm sorry, getting myself mixed up. The Megillas Esther died just before the Spanish Inquisition. He was living in Spain, and he died just before the Spanish Inquisition. The Megillas Esther, the name of his work, we're not talking about the book of Esther that we read on Purim. We're not talking about the scroll of the Megillah. What we're referring to is a book that he wrote in memory of his mother. His mother's name was Esther, and he wrote a book in memory of his mother, and he called it Megillas Esther. And his book is a commentary focused on those places where the Rambam seems to have missed something. And what he does is he tries to defend the Rambam against the attacks of the Ramban Nachmanides. Remember, we pointed out that at the end of the Rambam's list of the 613 mitzvot, the Ramban Nachmanides, who's a little younger than the Rambam, he shows us all of the mitzvos that the Rambam missed, what he forgot to include. So the Megillas Esther comes along to tell us, no, he didn't forget to include them. He purposely did not include them. And one of the ones on that list, as we pointed out, was living in the land of Israel. So the Megillas Esther, and this is also the opinion of the Minchas Aluzar, the Munkatcher Rebbe. They both are of the opinion that it's because the Rambam assumes there's no mitzvah to live in the land of Israel today. It's a very radical opinion, not accepted by normative Judaism, that there's no mitzvah to live in the land of Israel. And they point out because, once we were kicked out of the land, as we started the shir by pointing out the pasuk in Yirmiyahu that the land is empty, and hopefully Mashiach will come soon and the land will be rebuilt completely. But until that point, it would seem as though, at least what the Megillas Esther says, based on the Rambam, there's no obligation to try and fill it or rebuild it. We have a spiritual obligation to try and better ourselves in order so that we can merit the Mashiach, the full redemption, in order so that the land of Israel could be filled again with spirituality and an abundance of people, of a land flowing of milk, honey, and mitzvot. However, until that point, so there's no obligation to live in the land of Israel. That's what the Megillas Esther says based on the Rambam. However, as I pointed out, that is not normative Judaism. That's not normative Psak. And the Avnei Nezer, Rav Avram Bornstein, the Sakhachev Rebbe, the super genius, comes in again in his very long response, attacking the Megillas Esther, and he says, "What? First of all, he attacks him both based on his premise and on his conclusion. He says, first of all, your premise is completely off. Even if you want to say that this mitzvah does not apply today, that wouldn't be a reason for the Rambam not to include it on his list. If the mitzvah to live in the land of Israel did not apply today, that wouldn't be a reason for the Rambam to exclude it from his list of 613. He says, sacrifices are on the list of the 613. Does anyone bring a sacrifice today? No. I know of a couple people, though, that this Pesach put down payments on sheep because they were assuming Mashiach was coming this year. But generally speaking, people are not bringing karbanos today, right? In fact, there's a prohibition of even going onto Har HaBayis, because since we're all tameh, we're all impure right now. Therefore, going onto the Temple Mount today would be a prohibition. No one's bringing sacrifices today. And yet, what does the Rambam do? He includes it in his list of the 613. When's the next time we're going to bring sacrifices? When Mashiach comes. And yet, the Rambam puts it on his list of 613. So you can't tell me that just because the Rambam left it out of his list of the 613, that it's because it doesn't apply today. So what? And it's only going to apply when Mashiach comes. So what? Still, the Rambam would include it in his list of the 613. That's the first point of contention that we find between the Avnei Nezer and the Megillas Esther. But then second, he says that why would the Rambam exclude something that's only short term? I understand that there is that there was an obligation for us to go conquer the land of Israel with Yehoshua, but then after we were kicked out of the land, so then therefore there's no more obligation to go conquer the land of Israel. Who says? Oh, you want to tell me because it's only a short-term obligation? And the Rambam told us that he does not include short-term obligations. When the Rambam said he didn't include short-term obligations, he gave us an example. You know what the example was? When God commands Moshe, raise your hand and allow the sea to split before you. There was an obligation for Moshe, so that obligation no longer applies today because that was a one-time obligation. It's something like that doesn't apply anymore as a mitzvah. That's a one-time obligation when it's literally only once in history that there's an obligation to do so. However, the obligation to go conquer the land of Israel is something that started with Yehoshua and continues to today. This is, of course, the way that we assume in the halacha that there's an obligation to live in the land of Israel. And as we pointed out, we said that the Rambam didn't feel the need to list this as one of his mitzvos. In fact, my Rabbi Rav Hershel Schachter pointed out, based on the Ramban in a couple of places, that there would be no reason to list it as one of the 613 mitzvos. You know why? Because it's such an obvious thing. As we pointed out, the mitzvah to live in the land of Israel, living in the land of Israel, is such a central theme in the Torah that it's just part of Judaism. Like, for example, I'll give you another example. The Torah tells us, Tamim tihiyeh im Hashem Elokecha, that the pasuk in Parshas Ki Savo says that there's an obligation to have a wholesome relationship with God. You know, the Rambam does not include that in his list of the 613 mitzvahs. Why? Because that's just called being Jewish. Following the Torah is just called being Jewish. Living in the land of Israel is just called being Jewish. Therefore, said Rav Schachter, he said that the Rambam didn't need to include it. It's just called being Jewish. In Mitzvah Shem, soon we should all be zocheh to pick up and move to the land of Israel, so that way we could fulfill, as the Navi had said to us, that Karlecha Tzion Hi Doresh Ein La, that instead we should change it to that, yes, there is a Doresh La, there are those that are interacting with the land, not just through learning Torah about the land of Israel, but actually living in the land of Israel and experiencing the land of Israel and touching the land of Israel. And we shall all be zocheh to that soon. God willing, next week we'll discuss further the mitzvah to live in the land of Israel, the exceptions and the exemptions to living in the land of Israel. For now, we will stop here. Look forward to seeing everybody next week. Tomorrow night, there is a Parsha pump-up shir about the dangers of Lashon Hara. I'm looking forward to learning with everybody tomorrow night, and God willing, continuing this series next Wednesday night. I want to again thank Jerry and Sheila for sponsoring, and may the neshama have an aliyah. Have a good night, everybody.
Thank you.
If you have questions, I could stay on for a couple more minutes.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.